Chapter 20. The Promise Fulfilled. So the time of dwelling in Gerar was not entirely futile, as it had been in Mizraim. Abraham was allowed to sojourn in the southern land, and Sarah was returned to him. Furthermore, the malady that afflicted the Philistines came to a swift end. So it seemed that everything was once more going well for Abraham and his household. They went here and there, as they always did, looking for water and fresh pastures for their flocks. Abraham did as he was wont, and built altars in the land, where he prayed and sacrificed to the Eternal his God. It was after one such offering that Eleazar approached his master with a question. "My lord," he said, "pardon me for asking, but I must set my mind to rest in this matter." "Speak, my good man," Abraham replied. "When we were in Mizraim, we were forced to leave the land on account of telling Pharaoh that the lady Sarah was your sister and not your wife," Eleazar began. "Yet here we are, in the land of the Philistines, having done the same thing to Abimelech as to Pharaoh. More than that, Abimelech gifted you with even more substance than before. Wherefore is it that the Eternal smiles upon your deception now, and not in Mizraim? Is it because we are in the land of promise?" "I've often thought about that, Eleazar," Abraham replied, "and I can provide no clear answer for that. Who can tell what the Eternal does? Who can know his plans if he deems to hide them from us? If we could do this, then he would not be the Eternal." "If I may say so, my lord," Eleazar returned, "it seems fairly convenient to say these things when the Eternal winks at your misdeeds. If he chastises you for a misdeed, will you indeed say as you have said now?" "That is too bold of you," Abraham dismissed. Indeed, it had been a point of some consternation for him. Eleazar's words had stung Abraham to the core. For the time being, he had been content to believe that the Eternal would do good to him if he remembered to sacrifice to him and spread the truth about him with those to whom he came in contact. It never occurred to him that the Eternal might not approve of something he would say or do. Now that Eleazar said as he had, Abraham feared that something might happen. But for the time being, nothing happened. 3 months passed, and then another 3 were added. Another 6 months came, and now Abraham celebrated his second Jubilee. 100 years of walking the earth, from the heights of Mount Ararat to the land of Mizraim. Sarah sewed for him a brand new cloth bracelet with 2 Jubilee balls of thread upon it to represent his long lifespan. The servants celebrated their master with a great feast, provided for by game from one of Ishmael's hunts. At the end of 4 months, Sarah now achieved the age of 80, a truly notable age, even in the after days when the children rarely attained 80 years. But there was another reason for celebration that was almost lost on all of them. Far to the north, in Shechem, underneath the oak of Mamre, the sun stood at the exact same place where Michael set the knife in the earth some 360 days previously. The time had come at last. The change came on little by little, imperceptible to all. It had been many years since Sarah had last bled, after the manner of women, and she expected to never bleed again. Therefore, while many women in the camp would have rejoiced after ceasing to bleed, the moment it began was unnoticed by Sarah. After a time, she became very sick and was often confined to her tent, cared for by Hannah and not Hagar, at her request. As she was so old, illnesses were more severe in these advanced years than in her younger days. Indeed, many of their servants, both male and female, had met with their deaths from illness when they came to such great ages. To the surprise of the maidservant, who was roughly the same age as Ishmael, that is to say, 14 years of age, the illness left after only a few weeks. "My lady," she exclaimed, "I've only seen this kind of sickness a few times before, but I never would have expected it from you." "Why not?" Sarah asked. "It's only natural for people to get ill easily when they're as old as me. You needn't temper your words to me." "I know," Hannah replied, "and if you were my age, I would know for certain wherefore this came upon you." "Don't say that," Sarah said, closing her eyes and shaking her head. "Be kind to your mistress, and don't fill my head with false hopes." But things had only just begun. As the days since the passing of the year became months, and one month became 2, and then another month became 3, Sarah realized that there was indeed something else happening to her. Every time she would stand up, her stomach seemed to protrude slightly against the silhouette of her body. Most curious, for she had gained much weight in all her life wandering at the side of her husband. A strange feeling of renewed vigor came into Sarah at this time, and she was often found about the camp, overseeing the maidservants and providing helpful tips to the women as they cooked. One day, roughly 5 months after the sun stood over the knife at the Oak of Mamre, Sarah was busy overseeing the women of the camp threshing grain for the bread. It was their custom to buy grain for their bread, thresh the chaff away, and grind the seed to meal. Sarah had servants to thresh grain for her and save her hands from being calloused, yet attended those who now worked to see that all was going according to the normal routine. While she was preparing to leave, Sarah suddenly came to an abrupt halt, a look of perplexed wonder on her face as her hands reached for her stomach. She had felt something move inside her body. Eagerly she held her hands over her stomach, which was now quite noticeable even between her robes, and hoped and prayed that she hadn't merely imagined it. Just beneath her right hand, the feeling of a tiny form pushing against her stomach was felt. Sarah practically doubled over, laughing as tears of happiness ran down her cheeks. Immediately she called for Hannah and told her to bring Abraham to her tent at once, but not to tell him why. Eagerly she went back to her tent, a wide, beaming smile upon her face. Doffing her veil and taking her polished mirror, she examined her face and wiped the streams of kohl off her cheeks. For a moment she thought about reapplying it, but then decided against it. There was no further need to wear it. She no longer cared how she looked, now that it had come to pass at last. At length, Abraham entered the tent, looking rather flustered.
"Your maidservant said that this was urgent,"
he told her. He took one look at Sarah, only seeing her from the rear.
"Are you well?"
Sarah turned about and threw her arms around Abraham's shoulders. Gently he patted her head, still quite surprised at what had happened.
"You know that I love you," he said. "But is this indeed necessary right now? There's work to do."
But Sarah was insistent. She placed her fingers upon his lips to silence him. Shh. Then nestled her head against his chest and beard. "My lord, my love," Sarah whispered. "There's something wonderful I have to tell you." She looked up at Abraham, beaming with joy, and her eyes welling up with more tears of happiness, with both arms wrapped around his shoulders. "I'm with child." Abraham's mouth hung open in shock at the news. He took a step back and noticed the curve of Sarah's stomach beneath her robe. She reached out and took his hand, placed it thereon. Abraham gasped, his lips quivering with happiness as he felt movement beneath his hand. Sarah was smiling at him, wider than he had seen her smile before in his entire life. And suddenly Abraham realized that he was smiling and laughing as well. They wrapped their arms around each other and broke down into tears of joy.
"Praise be the Eternal who has brought forth this great miracle,"
Abraham sobbed into the top of his wife's head. Almost as soon as he heard of this, Abraham began planning for a great celebration. He had his servants deliver messages to Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, and to Terah and Nahor in Padan, calling them to Gerar for the birth of his son. Furthermore, he sent Eleazar on a camel loaded with food and supplies on an even longer journey far into the north, to the house of Shem, to invite the son of Noah for this glorious occasion. Eleazar was much put off by this, begging Abraham not to send him from the camp for so long. Abraham put his hands on his servant's shoulders and assured him that he would not be gone permanently, and that he would pray the Eternal speed him on his way back to their camp. In addition, Abraham gave Eleazar a bag of silver with which to buy food and water for himself in the places where he would be going, as the full journey would be long enough indeed. Eleazar left early the next morning, leading the company of servants that would be going north and east to Padan. Another month passed, and Sarah continued to grow large, her swollen stomach now visible even through her relatively loose robes. It was now common knowledge in the camp, and all the maid-servants flocked to Sarah's side, whether to steal awestruck gazes or to offer help to her in any way that they could. Hannah was the most helpful during this time, which Sarah most appreciated. Of course, the oddest part of all this was the fact that, when the time finally came for her to be delivered, she would be attended on by women many years younger than her. Hagar, who had enjoyed the attention of the servants when she was with child, now looked upon Sarah with contempt and quiet resentment as she was receiving the attention which she formerly enjoyed. "It's not right," she told Ishmael one evening, that dry old cow should be given so much attention for one child. I gave Abraham his first child, his eldest son, and I can give him many more besides. I will not be forgotten so easily." Aside from this, the messengers to Abimelech returned to Abraham's camp, regaling to him that Abimelech had laughed at the prospect that a man of 100 years should bear a child. But Abraham was not angered at this news, for he saw the truth with his own eyes. Instead, he sent his servants back to Abimelech with the same invitation, telling them to come and see for themselves. The next month came, and now Sarah was confined to her tent, barely able to move. Her condition aside, she was greatly aged. The other maidservants remarked that not only was it a miracle for a woman of such great age to conceive, but that she was still able to bear the child within her womb for all these many months. Hagar secretly wished that Sarah would die on account of her age and her condition, and that the child would die as well. Indeed, Hagar would whisper among the other maidservants, while they cooked or winnowed grain, that Sarah could not last long in her condition. "It's a trial and a half to bear children, as we all know," she would tell them, mincing her words with sophistry learned in the harem of Mizraim. "For this reason, the young who are able to bear the trial should give birth, and not those who are so feeble with age that they may not live long enough to nurse their own children." Yet the Eternal, who had foreseen this great trial since he pronounced it upon Eve, ordained that Sarah would not have to be any longer encumbered and pained by it. At the end of 7 months, while she was in her tent, with Hannah combing her silvery white hair, a great tightness gripped her stomach. Again it came upon her, and she nearly collapsed onto her face, groaning with great pain. Hannah took her and held her up by her shoulders, realizing suddenly that her mistress's time had come. Frantically trying to recall everything her mother, who had also served as a midwife to the servants of the camp, had told her, she told Sarah to remain calm and breathe deeply while she fetched the birthing stool. As she was making haste from Sarah's tent, she told one of the other servants to tell Abraham that the mistress's time had come to be delivered. By the time she had found the birthing stool and was making her way back to Sarah's tent, the news had spread halfway across the camp. Within 30 minutes, Abraham was standing without the door of his wife's tent, calling out to her. Sarah! Hannah poked her head out of the tent, but kept it tightly closed, so as to not shame her mistress in her time.
"How is Sarah?"
Abraham asked. "My lady is well, my lord," Hannah replied, "but it will yet be some time until she's ready to be delivered. I will send you word when all is done." Now came the hard part, the waiting. For those in the tent it was more than a trial, but for Abraham, who had to endure the agonized groans and wails of his wife Sarah, it was indeed troublesome. He felt so helpless, pacing about the camp with his staff in hand, hearing his love in pain and unable to succor her. He went among the flocks to take care of them, if only to busy himself, and not hear the sound of wailing and travail. Yet even so far away, he could still hear the faint sound of Sarah's groans for the rest of the day, and well into the night. The evening passed, and the darkness of night fell upon the desert of Gerar. The whole camp could hardly sleep for the carryings on that were taking place. Abraham paced about the camp, with nothing to do but wait, as he had for the past jubilee of years. Sometimes he would look at his wrist and admire the cloth bracelet that Sarah had made him. 100 years, 2 whole jubilees. But even then, he couldn't get from his mind the sound of her agony. For one moment he left the camp, and went out to the altar he had built in Gerar. The remains of the evening sacrifice were still smoking in the darkness, the dull embers giving off an eerie glow.
"Eternal, sovereign ruler of heaven and earth,"
Abraham prayed, looking up into the inky black night sky.
"Thou hast promised to make my seed as numerous as the dust of the earth. Tonight is the first fruits of the fulfillment of that covenant. For my sake, O merciful God, who has showered me with mercy upon mercy, and for the sake of thy great mercy, let my wife Sarah live to see our son, the son of promise, come into manhood. Amen."
Scarcely had Abraham finished his prayer, but the sound of women's voices raised up and joyous ululations resounded from the camp behind him. Abraham rushed back, his staff in hand, and with speed hardly expected for one so old. Before Sarah's tent, he came to a halt after his great run into the camp. A large crowd of all those that had gathered about that day and long into the night were waiting there. As the servants saw who was behind them, they parted like a wave from the shores of the sea, giving him a path to walk through. As he approached the door of the tent, Hannah stepped out and bowed before her master.
"What has happened?"
Abraham asked her. "My lord, you have a son," Hannah replied. Abraham could hardly believe what he had heard. He had to steady himself upon his staff to keep from falling over from shock of what he had heard. His lips quivered into a smile, and his eyes once more watered up with tears.
"And my lady Sarah?" he asked. "How is she?"
"She is well, my lord," Hannah answered. "She is resting inside the tent, with the child in her arms. She wishes to see you." Without another word, Abraham made his way into the tent, and gasped in amazement. Sarah was laying upon the rug that served as her bed, propped up into a seated position by several pillows. Her headscarf had been removed, and her long silver hair was arrayed in damp locks about her head and shoulders. Her robe was pulled down off one shoulder, and in her arms, cuddled at her breast, was a tiny baby nursing quietly. As Abraham gazed upon her, he was reminded of how she had first appeared to him 50 years ago, in the gown of the women of Ur. Now here she was, still as radiant as ever, and yet seemed more exalted than she had been then. Abraham's old face came to life. The creases on his forehead and the corners of his eyes spread as he smiled widely in return, his old brown eyes welling with tears. Sarah looked up from the babe in her arms and smiled widely. "Behold, my lord," Sarah said to Abraham in a soft whisper, "thy son." "And mine," She let out a soft chuckle as she said those words, looking back down at the little baby. This was her child. Abraham could scarcely believe how happy his wife was. He couldn't remember another time when he had seen her so happy and full of joy.
"The name of the child,"
Abraham said with a smile on his face,
"shall be Isaac."
Sarah chuckled, looking down at the tiny squished face cozied up to her bosom. Who would have thought that the daughter of Haran would nurse a child at her own bosom? She sighed pleasantly as waves of euphoria washed over her. I have borne my lord a son in his old age. The Eternals made me to laugh, and all that here will laugh with me. Outside the tent there came a soft wave of laughter as the women did as the great lady had ordered them. Inside, Abraham held out his hands to have the son put into his arms. Sarah placed one hand beneath the baby's head, and after gently extricating his mouth, placed the other hand beneath the baby's lower body, and placed him in her husband's hands. The little child in his hands made him feel young again, as he hadn't felt in over a jubilee or even 70 years. He gently placed a kiss on the baby's little bald head, then rose up to his feet and, despite Sarah's wearied protest, don't, brought the little child out to the servants before him and held him up for them all to see.
"Behold, servants of Abraham, keepers of the covenant,"
he cried out.
"I have a son!"
The story continues in chapter 21.